Hi, my name is Keith Idso. Today I'd like to talk to you about my presentation, The Use of Brown Bear by Alaskan Natives as a Subsistence Food. The reason why I got interested in this topic is because I hunt. I consider myself a subsistence hunter in the state of Arizona. I don't hunt for sport, I don't want trophies on my wall, but I hunt for meat to fill my freezer. Alaskan natives are very good at using their surrounding environment for things that they need for food, for shelter, and water. Some of their very popular traditional subsistence foods that I've read about in this course include seal, whale, walrus, and salmon, which I kind of group together as water creatures, and then some of the terrestrial land creatures that they commonly eat, like the moose, caribou, and sheep. In addition to these animals, native Alaskans also consume various plants and berries within their subsistence food diet. When looking at the research done by Berseman et al. In 2007, I was kind of surprised to look at the subsistence food caloric intake percentage. In other words, out of the subsistence foods eaten by native Alaskans, what percentage of the caloric intake was actually comprised of things like fish or game meat. I was quite shocked to find out that fish, and I guess sea animals as well, made up over 50% of the caloric food take on a percentage basis. And even more shocking was the fact that game meats were only 14%. And I was actually surprised by that because I always think about all the caribou herds, especially all the moose that are harvested out there, and even some of the muskox. And yet, game meats, terrestrial land animals, were only 14% of the caloric intake of their subsistence diet. And again, that was quite shocking. And with respect to the previous slide, and all the other papers I've read for this class, I came across nothing talking about using grizzly bear as a subsistence meat. And just a couple of times, there was just an ancillary remark about utilizing black bear, but I found nothing about harvesting and using grizzly bear or brown bear as a subsistence food. And that's what drew me to this topic, because I know other hunters from Alaska who have harvested grizzly bear, and most of them do not retain the meat. And so I was curious, do Alaskan natives harvest grizzly? Do they eat the brown bear up there? So once again, Alaskan natives do eat a lot of whale meat. They do consume walrus, seals, and lots of salmon, as I was able to experience this past summer up there with some Alaskans who are doing their subsistence fishing of salmon. Quite interesting using a 5-foot diameter dip net to catch salmon out of the streams. Very fun to watch that happening. Obviously, like I previously stated, there's lots of harvesting of caribou up there by Alaskan natives, as well as moose and even some sheep. But again, the harvesting of grizzly bear or the brown bear, which essentially are the same species, was hardly even discussed. The brown bear, Ursus arctos, is prevalent throughout the state of Alaska, and it has the greatest population of brown bears in the northern hemisphere. Now, technically speaking, brown bears and grizzly bears are the same genus and species. Biologists kind of classify the brown bears as the grizzlies that live closer to the coast, that have milder climates during the winter and greater access to salmon runs. So brown bears in that respect get larger in size because of the lengthened feeding season, larger in size than the standard grizzly bear. But they can interbreed, and they are the same genus and species. In 1996, Fall et al. Wrote an interesting paper that kind of looked at subsistence bear harvests in southeast Alaska and regular harvests of brown bear within that area. Traditionally, the Tlingit lived down in that part of Alaska, and out of all the bears harvested in their paper, 79% of the harvests of brown bears were done by sport hunters, while only 19% were done by subsistent hunters, which primarily again were the Tlingit. In contrast, Loon and Georgette in 1989 reported on bear harvests in northwest Alaska by the Inupiaq and sport hunters in that region as well. And here the numbers were kind of turned around. Only 38% of the harvests were done by sport hunters, while 62% were taken by subsistence Inupiaq hunting to fill their freezers. I thought that was quite interesting, and when thinking about the discrepancy in these numbers between the two parts of the state, again, I thought about the bear biology and the habitats. In the northwest Alaskan area, you have much colder climates and you have a shortened growing season. So bears have to go into hibernation earlier, so they don't get to get as large in their mass and sizes as bears down in the southeastern portion of the state. And hence it kind of makes sense there's less sport hunters going to northwest Alaska because the bears there are smaller. And the sport hunters primarily are after the hides and the skulls, while the subsistence hunters are required to take the meat out of the field as well. Not surprisingly, I guess, there has been a decline in the subsistence harvest of brown bear over the past several decades in Alaska. There's a lot of ideas as to why there's a decrease in brown bear hunting amongst natives. And one of the reasons is that there has been an increased wage earning that's been going on in the past couple decades. And with increased wages, obviously individuals are able to go out and buy commodity foods instead of having to take as many subsistence animals to provide for their sustenance. In addition, there's an increased availability of market foods because of better transportation and better networking. Some of the remote villages now have more access to market foods. So again, they're not necessarily being forced to eat subsistence foods all the time. An interesting thing about bears in general, and that includes the grizzly and brown bear as well, is that bears carry the trichinosis parasite inside of their muscle tissues. And it's similar to the trichinosis that you get from consuming uncooked pork. And so there's a fear that, hey, if we don't cook our bear meat well enough, we might contract trichinosis and become very sick. There's also a fear of state laws and regulations, and that in itself is worthy enough to talk about it in its own separate category. With respect to game laws of the state of Alaska, there definitely are some fears that are perpetuated and even some cultural challenges that kind of exist to the laws that are in the books. First of all, in order to hunt brown bear, you have to buy a permit. I mean, it sounds like a no-brainer to some of us, but for an Alaskan native, buying a permit is kind of akin to bragging and showing off. It's kind of boasting in a way, which is highly discredited among the Tlingit and even the Inupiaq. And so even just buying a bear permit is kind of something that is culturally taboo for them. Similar to that is reporting the harvest. Again, within their cultures, that is very much akin to bragging and being boastful. And here they have to go off their traditional village areas and report to an official that, hey, look what I've done. I've harvested this bear. And again, that's something that they don't want to do. They don't want to attract attention to themselves, especially kind of showing off their hunting abilities. And finally, one of the requirements after harvesting a brown bear in Alaska is you actually have to bring the skull in to a wildlife official who will measure it, pull a tooth out of it, and do what they call sealing the skull, which is putting a band through the skull, kind of like an identification marker to show who shot it and when they shot it, that sort of thing. And then they use that for transporting the bear skull throughout the state or outside of the state. And this is really something that's a challenge to some of the cultural people in the area, because amongst the Tlingit and the Inupiaq, they've been taught to leave that skull out in the field. Sometimes they turn that skull to have it face the east to welcome the rising sun, but it's something they've always done to honor that bear for giving its life to the people. So in essence, bringing that skull in from the field shows disrespect towards that animal that was harvested. One of the neat aspects I enjoyed learning about when it comes to subsistence hunting is the actual community involvement that takes place. Oftentimes there are just a few hunters from a given small village who go out and hunt these animals that have the skills and tracking abilities necessary to find and take them. So there's some hunting together of a few individuals, but once an animal is downed, there's other help of processing the carcass. And that's obviously something that we've seen in some of the photographs for wells that are taken, where an entire community is helping to pull that well out of the ocean and to help cut up the blubber and make edible portions for everyone to share. We've seen lots of community processing of salmon to get the salmon cleaned and hung on the wooden racks to dry. But there's also a little bit of community involvement when you take a brown bear because of their size once again. But no matter what subsistence animal is taken, you always see this sharing of the meat and the fat. Oftentimes an elder is given some of the best cuts of the meat, and most hunters keep very little of the meat for themselves. Most of it is usually given away to others. In a couple of the papers I read, I learned that seal fat is often boiled and melted down into an oil, and that oil is used for dipping meats and fish and other edible things into to help flavor it. I also read a similar thing about the fat off the brown bear, that it too can be rendered and boiled down and turned into an oil that can be used for dipping meats in to make them tastier and more palatable. I experienced something back in March that I was really excited about. One of my teaching colleagues left our reservation in the lower 48 and took a teaching position up in Wainwright this fall, and they've been teaching there since August. I told this individual, please be on the lookout for subsistence hunting stories, particularly bear. If a grizzly or brown bear is shot, please let me know about it. Well, I received a couple of messages in March from this colleague saying, look what happened today. Now, although it's not a brown bear, I was extremely excited because nonetheless, a polar bear is at least in that bear family. And this individual told me that while they were teaching, a call came out on the CB and even over their intercom that a whaling captain had just shot a polar bear that wandered into town, and that the meat would be available and ready for pickup at a certain crossroads where two streets met, apparently. And she said that school got out 2 hours after that announcement. And when she got there 2 hours later, all the meat was basically gone. And the chunks in that second picture were gone as well. She said all there was were a few little stains where the carcass had been processed there. So I was quite excited to see that after reading these reports of community sharing of subsistent meats, particularly bear, that this event took place and that it still does happen. And I was pleased to see the validity in the continuity of this traditional sharing of game meats. Quite exciting. In summary then, I'd just like to recap that I really enjoyed learning about subsistence hunting of brown bear in Alaska. It's definitely clear that natives in the Northwest and the Southeast continue to harvest and eat subsistence brown bear in those areas. Now, the subsistence take has definitely increased over time, and there's many reasons why, once again including some better tasting market foods that are more readily available, an increased wage economy, which allows individuals to buy those processed foods. And then we have interference that's caused by some of these culturally restrictive game laws. So although these things have been decreasing the brown bear harvest in the subsistence lifestyle, it has not exterminated it. So we need to make sure that we protect the legislation and the rights of native subsistence hunters to allow them to continue to take brown bear and grizzly bear to help sustain their families. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and I've really enjoyed taking this class, and thanks for viewing. And I'll just close out with the subsistence bear from the state of Arizona. Thanks a lot.